Israel is bombing and starving Gaza. It's made millions of people dependent on aid, then confined them to pens while they wait for it, and sometimes opened fire on them. Donald Trump is proposing ejecting everyone from Gaza so his buddies can build hotels there. More Israelis than ever are calling for ethnic cleansing. How did things get to this point? How did millions in Israel, the US, and elsewhere acquire a taste for Palestinian suffering? How did they come to see genocide as a solution to their problems? There are a lot of ways to answer those questions, but one I don't look at enough on this channel is trauma. Trauma can be individual, but it can also be collective, affecting whole cultures and nations, shaping their outlook, justifying policy. Today we're going to talk about trauma and revenge in the history of Israel and Palestine. Right after this ad. Hey, it's me, Chris, out here just trying to make a living. Would you like some soap made from my bathwater? You know what? Don't waste your money on that. Give whatever you can to people in Gaza. They're being starved to death. And please overthrow all political systems standing in the way of freedom for Gaza. Okay, that's the ad. This video is about trauma in Israel and Palestine, but its points can be applied to societies all over the world. People are traumatized. The cause might have been something as catastrophic as a war or natural disaster or school shooting. It might have been getting slapped by your mother. All of them can leave emotional scars that affect our behavior our whole life. It's not just some people who are traumatized and the rest of us are fine. Trauma pervades our culture, from personal functioning through social relationships, parenting, education, popular culture, economics, and politics. In fact, someone without the marks of trauma would be an outlier in our society. Trauma is an inner injury, a lasting rupture or split within the self due to difficult or hurtful events. Trauma is not what happens to you, but what happens inside you. It is a constellation of hardships, composed of the wound itself and the residual burdens that our woundedness imposes on our bodies and souls, the unresolved emotions they visit upon us, the coping dynamics they dictate, the tragic or melodramatic or neurotic scripts we unwittingly but inexorably live out, and not least the toll these take on our bodies. Trauma, until we work it through, keeps us stuck in the past, robbing us of the present moment's riches, limiting who we can be. The consequences of post-traumatic stress can be severe enough to disrupt mood, behavior, cognition, sleep, interpersonal relationships, and a sense of well-being, leaving countless individuals with a condition today referred to as post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. Common symptoms of PTSD, ranging between hyper and hypoarousal, are severe anxiety, agitation, irritability and/or depression, hostility, distrust, fear and/or aggression, hypervigilance or numbness, poor impulse control including self-destructive behaviors, e.g. hypersexuality or risk-seeking, loss of interest in pleasurable activities or usual routines, and emotional detachment, avoidance, and social isolation. Other common identifying symptoms of PTSD include flashbacks as well as nightmares and patterns of disturbed sleep. One study of former ISIS members found aggression is strongly correlated with traumatic war events, perpetration events, and mental health among incarcerated terrorist group members. Moreover, trauma gets passed on down the generations, from parent to child or from the wider culture to the child. Studies find the children and grandchildren of people who've suffered through horrors like war, genocide, slavery, poverty, and abuse tend to have higher rates of PTSD, anxiety, depression, learning difficulties, and drug use than average. Not all PTSD is diagnosed, and people might suffer from more hidden effects like guilt, shame, and rage, but don't have a diagnosis, so don't get treated. When trauma affects whole societies, it's felt by people who never experienced the events that caused it. We may need to disengage from the toxic social environment we find ourselves in before we can heal, and that's not always possible. We might turn our trauma outward, to the people we've been told it's okay to be cruel to. I don't want to imply here that all violence comes from trauma, or trauma inevitably leads to violence, or anything simplistic like that. Violence is a really complex phenomenon, and this is one way to understand it. By no means am I trying to make sweeping pronouncements about why war and violence occur, even in the particular contexts I'm talking about. I'm not saying one's trauma is a legitimate reason to hurt others. And I'm not a psychiatrist who's qualified to diagnose anyone with anything. I just think unresolved, unacknowledged trauma is a factor in collective violence, and we see its results every day. If we know the context of the violence in Palestine, we can see how each group deals with pain by meting out revenge on the other, and thereby find ways to break the cycle. Most nations are forged in war or some other atrocity. How do the scars heal? Not only were Israeli and Palestinian identities the product of war, that war has never ended. There are ways to heal trauma, but it won't heal if the cause keeps reappearing. If every day you're reminded you could die at any minute, you're not going to recover from the anxiety that induces. We're going to look at various events in the history of Israel and Palestine to understand where this conflict comes from, why it seems eternal and insoluble. We're actually going to go through two parallel histories, first from a perspective on Israeli collective trauma, then from that of the Palestinians, in order to show that what you remember and how it affects you depends on where you stand. Where did Israel come from? If we were to start in 1948, when the state was founded, or even 1897 with the first Zionist Congress, we would be missing something. What prompted the modern Zionist movement to form in the first place? Over 2,000 years of anti-Semitism. We let history shape our consciousness by selecting what to remember and what to forget. Trauma is a part of our telling of history. Instead of breaking the cycle of trauma, we get regularly reminded of the apparent wounds other people have inflicted on us. Anti-Semitism is a wound that has never had a chance to heal, as it keeps getting reopened every day as someone targets someone else for violence just for being Jewish. A lot of the history that's taught and believed is BS, but what matters for our purposes is what people think. History is a weapon the state can use to guide our behavior for our whole lives, like when it turns us into nationalists and soldiers and border police whose jobs are to ruin people's lives for my country. States teach history by selecting events and processes and using them to convey the message they want. Our country is about freedom. See? We fought this war for freedom. And we haven't been free since, but we believe in it. Well, not for most people. We can always think of reasons why those people should be in prison, like if they cross the border without permission from the government, obviously. But we definitely believe in the word freedom. It's in our national anthem. A lot of history is an outright lie. For example, for a while, Israel taught students the reason 780,000 Arabs left Palestine in 1947 and 8 was because the Arab powers broadcast on the radio that they should leave so they wouldn't get caught in the crossfire when the surrounding Arab states invaded Israel. That and other lies were punctured by Israeli historians such as Benny Morris, Avi Shlaim, and Ilan Pappé. Schools began to teach an account closer to the truth that Zionist militias that eventually became the Israeli Defense Forces, or IDF, terrorized and massacred and kicked the Palestinians out. Because that's how you establish a new state. The history of Israel should be pretty familiar to those who know the history of other settler colonial states like the US and Canada. A terrible atrocity to found the country, followed by day-to-day violence to keep the native population down indefinitely. Still, when telling the history of Israel, you don't really have to lie too much to make Israel look like the victim. Though you might have to omit key facts. Or maybe you omit key people. The violent, symbolic, and real exclusion of people from the hegemonic narrative of the past is the source of the violence of the present. You could start history at a specific time to make pretty much anyone look like a victim. I was just standing here and that guy hit me. Oh, so he hit you for no reason? Well, no, I kicked him in the nuts first, but then I stood over here, minding my own business, and he just comes up and punches me in the face. Every time anyone has tried to kill Israelis, people have said Israel as a whole is under attack. Saying a country is under attack is a propaganda message to imply that everyone in the country is in danger, and a state killing 1,000 people is the same as someone sticking up for themselves. People die every day from various causes, but the minute someone from an out-group might be the cause, our entire civilization is under threat and we should mobilize all available resources to fight it. But even if we assume phrasing that treats countries like people makes sense, the question remains: why was Israel attacked? Instead of acknowledging at least 100 years of history, people make up reasons why the Arabs and Muslims are all just brought up to hate. If you think that, maybe consider that's what's happened to you. Maybe those people just remember. But none of this is to say Israelis don't have a reason to be traumatized. Trauma is baked into the state of Israel, starting with the memory of 2,000 years of anti-Semitism. I'm not really going to talk about it here, but one after another pogrom, a few hundred years of Inquisition, all of which culminated in an attempt to wipe them out completely, was enough to convince many European Jews they needed their own nation-state. Nationalism had been on the rise for centuries, but Jews had been left behind. They weren't really considered part of any single nation, even if they had lived there for centuries, because nations are exclusive groups. Jewish people, like Roma people, were never quite allowed to be one of us, so they were always an outgroup, and therefore a threat. Being an outgroup meant being a target to divert the attention of normal people from their real problems caused by their rulers to Jews who were just trying to live their lives. So the pogroms started. And they didn't really stop. We know anti-Semitism was still a valuable propaganda tool right up to the 20th century, not because of Hitler, but the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. In probably 1902, someone, probably Russian intelligence, wrote and disseminated protocols as if they were revealing a Jewish conspiracy to take over the world. And just a few months later, a new wave of pogroms began. Hitler read protocols. He said it was real. He spread its messages to indoctrinate a whole nation in anti-Semitism. Then he committed genocide. When nations are set up as fundamentally incompatible and permanently at odds, genocide sooner or later becomes the goal of the more powerful side. Removing any trace of your victim and your crime makes them easier to forget. Many Jews fled Nazi Europe, and many of them were turned away. The MS St. Louis had over 900 Jewish refugees on it who were rejected from Cuba, the US, and Canada. The ship turned around and went back to Europe, where an estimated quarter of the people aboard ended up killed by the Holocaust. And 2 ships of refugees were sunk by Soviet submarines. This indifference to the fate of refugees carries on to this day, as thousands die every year in the Mediterranean Sea fleeing to Europe, and it's kind of illegal to help them. But some Jews survived the Holocaust, and some of them made it to Palestine and joined in the founding of Israel. As soon as Israel was declared, it was attacked on all sides. Imagine you had just survived the Holocaust, the most unspeakable horrors people can go through, escaping to somewhere you thought was safer, only to get invaded. You would think it was starting all over again. The detail omitted from this account is the invading Arab states never had a chance of winning. The Zionist leadership was united in its goal of an Israeli state, and they had a plan. The same couldn't be said about Palestinian elites or the Arab states when they attacked. That the Arab states succeeded in fielding any soldiers at all is remarkable. Only at the end of April 1948 did the politicians in the Arab world prepare a plan to save Palestine, which in practice was a scheme to annex as much of it as possible to the Arab countries participating in the war. Most of these armies had very little war experience and were barely trained by the end of the mandate. The coordination between them was poor, as were the morale and motivation of the soldiers, apart from a large group of volunteers whose enthusiasm could not compensate for their lack of military skills. The poor level of performance on the battlefield was not just an Arab phenomenon, it was evident on the Jewish side too, which was at first handicapped by lack of firepower. This was amended during the first truce in the war in June 1948, when the Zionist leaders managed to purchase arms from the Eastern Bloc, while Britain, obeying a UN decree, imposed an embargo on 3 armies that used only British-made ammunition: Egypt, Iraq, and Jordan. Among the Jewish troops was a large number of fresh immigrants with no war experience, but the core of the army was better prepared and more experienced. The number of fighting men on both sides, including those from neighboring Arab countries, was almost equal throughout the war. The Israelis' collective memory would depict the war as the act of a national liberation movement, fighting both British colonialism and Arab hostility and winning against all odds. Their loss of 1% of the population would cloud the joy of achieving independence, but not the will and determination to Judaize Palestine and turn it into a future haven for world Jewry in the aftermath of the Holocaust. After the apparent attempt to wipe Israel out, the Arab League imposed sanctions on Israel and refused to recognize it. They adopted anti-Semitic propaganda, just as it was on the wane in Europe, including spreading the protocols of the Elders of Zion. States with Arab and Muslim rulers kicked hundreds of thousands of Jews out of their homes, though others left voluntarily. Many of them went to Israel, where new groups of traumatized people would join those already there. After the 1956 Suez Crisis, Israel and Egypt regularly threw around threats of returning to war, which resulted in an arms race and Israel's acquisition of nuclear weapons. In May 1967, Egypt's Gamal Abdel Nasser sent a large number of troops into the Sinai, kicking out the UN troops already there, and closed the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping. In Israel, Egypt, and Syria, the masses were whipped into a war frenzy. Israelis heard about the hourly radio reports from Arab countries threatening Israel's impending doom. Israel's Holocaust survivors were particularly scared when Israeli newspapers likened Nasser to Hitler. In January 1964, the Arab League convened in Cairo to discuss the threat Israel posed by diverting water from the north to irrigate the south, and thereby reduce water supplies available to Syria and Jordan. In their statement, they called for the final liquidation of Israel. The decisions that came out of the conference were to divert the headwaters of the Jordan River in Syria and Lebanon, to establish the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, and to set up a unified Arab military command. At the same time, Israel was being raided by Fatah guerrillas who were attempting to drag the Arab states into another war with Israel. Each side threatened to overthrow the other. Cairo radio said, "Our forces are in a complete state of readiness for war." Syria's government said, "The war of liberation will not end except by Israel's abolition." And Yitzhak Rabin said in a newspaper interview Israel would march to Damascus and topple the Syrian government. So on June 5th, 1967, when Israel launched a surprise attack on Egypt that destroyed its air force, Israelis could say they attacked preemptively to prevent an imminent attempt to wipe them out. When their tanks rolled into East Jerusalem, Gaza, the Sinai, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights, they could say it was necessary to occupy those lands as a security buffer. It's not like the Arab and Muslim states got any less hostile to Israel in the wake of the Six-Day War. In 1973, Israel was attacked. Egypt and Syria launched a joint attack on Israeli positions and made some gains, which eventually led to the 1978 Camp David Accords, the return of the Sinai to Egypt, and a peace between Egypt and Israel that continues to this day. But not everyone was content. The 1967 war had made more Palestinians homeless and put others under Israeli control. Egypt's President Anwar Sadat made some half-hearted efforts to include the Palestinians in the peace treaty, but Israel said no, so no. Palestinians were expendable. In the 1970s, Palestinian terrorism went international. Of many attacks that brought world attention to the Palestinian cause, the most infamous was probably the Munich massacre. A group calling itself Black September entered the Israeli athletes' compound at the 1972 Munich Olympics and took the team hostage. Black September called their operation Ikrit and Biram, after two Palestinian villages whose residents were killed or expelled in 1948. Munich was an act of revenge. In the messy rescue attempt that followed, Black September murdered 11 athletes and coaches. In response, Israel launched Operation Wrath of God, the assassination of those suspected of organizing the murders at Munich, dramatized in the film Munich. Wrath of God was followed by plane hijackings and more raids on Israeli territory, and the cycle of violence rolled on for decades. Suicide bombings were pioneered by the Tamil Tigers in 1987, but Palestinian militants like Hamas and Islamic Jihad adopted the tactic a couple of years later. Israel spent most of the 1990s in peace talks with the PLO, the only representative of Palestinians that any state would deal with. But every so often, someone would blow up a bus or a market. It would happen apparently at random, so you wouldn't know when or where it would come from. It's fair to call an act like this terrorism, since the goal is to make people afraid to leave their homes. The Second Intifada broke out in 2000, and the number of bombings increased dramatically. Even after putting up a security fence/apartheid wall, even after dismantling the settlements in Gaza, Israelis were still attacked. Thousands of rockets have been fired on Israel from the besieged territories. But I wonder if the word rockets conceals the fact that most of them didn't hit anyone, and most of the ones that found a target didn't kill. But they did leave many residents of southern Israel with PTSD. So Israel launched Operation Cast Lead in 2008. It devastated Gaza. Over 1,000 were killed. Whole neighborhoods were leveled. All the most powerful states supported the attack, either explicitly or tacitly. And yet somehow Israel was still the real victim, and the world was still against it. Benjamin Netanyahu went to the UN, talked about Auschwitz, and said those rockets being fired into Israel were basically the Holocaust. Larry Dürfner wrote sarcastically in the Jerusalem Post, "Who was the victim of Operation Cast Lead, them or us?" No question, us. It's we who've been suffering. Gazans? Suffering? What's everybody talking about? We let them eat, don't we? This imaginary monologue is how we actually see ourselves today. We initiated the war in Gaza, we waged one of the most one-sided military campaigns anyone's ever seen, and we're the victims. Auschwitz, lambs to the slaughter, Operation Cast Lead. To Israelis today, it's all of a piece. It's one story, one unbroken legacy of righteous victimhood. The truth is that the state of Israel has never been a victim, and our likening of ourselves to the 6 million has been embarrassing from the beginning. But now? After what we did in Gaza? But it makes sense for Israelis to see themselves as the victims. If you don't see your enemy as human, then nothing they ever do is justified, and everything you do to them is. They act only to victimize you, while you act only to defend yourself. Israel never fights wars of aggression because it defines its wars as defensive. Israel briefly felt the guilt of being an invader in 1982 when the world saw what it did in Lebanon, which we'll get to soon, and Israelis voted in a government that promised to negotiate peace, even though Israel didn't leave Lebanon till 2000. 2000 was also when peace talks with the PLO broke down and the Second Intifada began. We don't know what happened behind closed doors, but US and Israeli officials were quick to tell the world Arafat and the PLO wanted to destroy Israel, so they rejected a very generous offer and started the Intifada. Israeli self-image was satisfied. We're fair, they're implacable. We just want peace. They just want to eradicate us. As I'm sure everyone watching this knows, on October 7th, 2023, Palestinian militants, including Hamas, broke through the barrier sealing Gaza off from Israel and killed over 1,000 people in Israeli towns and military bases. October 7th was Israel's 9/11, a serious attack it could use to pursue its broader imperial aims more thoroughly at greater speed. Recently, we've seen it ramping up land grabs in the West Bank and attempting to occupy and annex northern Gaza. It's hard to see how any of what Israel's doing is to keep anyone safe. Israelis are now pretty pro-genocide. Some go watch the bombing of Gaza. Some take to social media to mock the people they're killing. Right-wing Israeli politicians still invoke the Holocaust every chance they get to justify their policies. Propagandists call every criticism of Israel terrorism. Every act of Israeli aggression turns into violence against Jews somewhere in the world. I hope everyone watching this can see the difference between Jews and a state. If not, I've got some videos. But Zionists will claim any attack on Israel is an attack on all Jews. Confusing anti-Semitism with anti-Zionism is a deliberate trick that doesn't make anyone safer, because people are attacking Jews on the assumption they're Zionists, which is wrong because there are plenty of anti-Zionist Jews. Attacking Jews for being Jewish doesn't help anyone except Zionists in power who use the attack to accelerate the genocide of Palestine and the persecution of the pro-Palestine movement. As Cheryl says, the only world that's safe for Jews is one that's safe for everyone else too. The history of Palestinians is no less traumatic than that of Israelis. Palestinians were inhabitants of a key region in World War I, so they suffered as much as anyone. When the British took over Palestine, they repressed the Arabs, but provided support to European Jews who were moving there. Zionists didn't start a state from scratch in 1948. They had already built the apparatus of governance under the British mandate. That said, Britain did curtail Jewish immigration to Palestine during the Holocaust, so they weren't quite benevolent. The indigenous population was further diminished by the crushing repression of the Great 1936-39 Arab Revolt against British rule, during which 10% of the adult male population was killed, wounded, imprisoned, or exiled, as the British employed 100,000 troops and air power to master Palestinian resistance. Then came the Nakba. 12 days after the adoption of the UN resolution to partition Palestine, the expulsion of Palestinians began. A month later, the first Palestinian village was wiped out by Jewish retaliation to a Palestinian attack on convoys and Jewish settlements. This action was transformed into an ethnic cleansing operation in March, which resulted in the loss to Palestine of much of its indigenous population. Several massacres were committed near the mixed towns, sometimes in retaliation for Palestinian attacks on Jewish convoys, but quite often they were unmitigated acts of brutality. They may have been meant to, as they eventually did, force Palestinians living in areas falling into Jewish hands to flee under the threat of death or eviction. These atrocities were not randomly committed. They were part of a master plan to rid the future Jewish state of as many Palestinians as possible. Professor Israel Shahak reckons almost 400 villages were destroyed completely, with their houses, garden walls, and even cemeteries and tombstones, so literally a stone does not remain standing, and visitors are passing and being told that it was all desert. The systematic aspect was in the methods employed, of first terrorizing the population, executing a few to induce others to leave, and then inviting an official committee to assess the value of land and property in the deserted villages or neighborhoods. Again, quite reminiscent of Europeans going to the Americas, committing genocide against people whose land they wanted, and renaming most places after Europeans. Israel has never stopped acquiring more land and erasing the memory of the people they evict. A week after the end of the Six-Day War, on June 17, 1967, the new Governor-General of Jerusalem, Chaim Herzog, began expelling all Arabs from the Jewish quarter of the city. From September, the government of Israel began encouraging Jewish settlement of the newly occupied territories with a view to eventually annexing them. The settlement enterprise was accompanied by a mass confiscation of land. This was begun by the army seeking land for its camps and installations, but afterwards most of the coveted land was allocated to the settlers. By 1972, Israel had confiscated almost 28% of the West Bank, and by 2000 this had risen to almost 42%. The Nakba was integral to the creation of a Palestinian identity. Central to this identity was the promise that Palestinians would return to Palestine. Promises and hope are dangerous things. How can a person heal from the demolition of their whole society and way of life if they're being promised they'll get it all back soon? But that's what everyone assured them. The fighters among them promised to liberate Palestine and let them all go back. The UN promised them they would go back. The United Nations Relief and Works Agency, or UNRWA, no one knows how to pronounce it, was established in January of 1949 to tend to the needs of 750,000 Palestinian refugees in camps bordering the new state of Israel. These camps were supposed to be temporary, pending the refugees' return to homes that weren't there anymore. The Palestinian refugee population was about to become the most surveilled group in human history. They would be harassed, expelled, and imprisoned for expressions of nationalism and resistance. As descendants of minorities and refugees going back 5 generations, the majority of Palestinians today live under surveillance of one form or another from cradle to grave. Their numbers are contested, their demography is analyzed and debated endlessly, their movement across international borders is closely monitored, their activities are routinely scrutinized for political content, and their citizenship status is a perennial topic of discussion. Palestinians have no state and have rarely had state allies that would assist them in reclaiming Palestine or even just leave them alone. The military defeat in 1948 made its Arab neighbors deeply fearful of Israel, whose powerful army continued to launch devastating strikes as part of a strategy of disproportionate reprisals for refugee incursions, aimed at forcing Arab governments to crack down on Palestinian irredentism. Rather than being allies of the Palestinians in their resistance to the low-level war being waged on them, the Arab governments hindered their efforts, and sometimes were complicit with the Palestinians' enemies. For a few years after 1948, Israel felt the need to define and secure its unsteady borders. The newly constituted IDF were constantly on the lookout for the next invasion, but instead of coming in the form of a unified Arab assault, it tended to be Palestinians crossing the armistice lines. Palestinians. Though most of them simply wanted to return to their homes or visit relatives, some attempted to exact revenge for the Nakba. They rarely did much damage, but because Israeli security forces adopt a policy of shoot first and ask questions later, somewhere between 2,700 and 5,000 people were killed crossing the border, most of them unarmed. Israeli policy has always been to take all the bait offered to it and severely punish both Palestinian resistance forces and anyone in the vicinity. Palestinians would attack from Gaza, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon, and Israel regularly attacked back. Civilians were often targeted or else just caught in the crossfire. In 1953, some people infiltrated Israel and murdered an Israeli mother and her 2 children near the Jordanian town of Gibeah. The IDF responded with a devastating raid on Gibeah, blowing up 45 houses and killing 69 civilians. Guerrilla attacks escalated, and in 1954, when the Gaza Strip was under Egyptian rule but inhabited by 300,000 Palestinian refugees, the IDF attacked Egyptian military outposts in Gaza and killed 37 Egyptian soldiers. The message was clear: control the Palestinians or you'll both be sorry. The growing militancy of the Palestinians, the raids, the plane hijackings, and the overwhelming Israeli responses made the Palestinians an enemy of some of their host states. After the 1967 Six-Day War, more Palestinians were forced to flee to neighboring countries. King Hussein became afraid the PLO was going to take over Jordan. In September 1970, he attempted to disarm the PLO in the refugee camps, which led to thousands of deaths and made the PLO flee to Lebanon. Israel intervened repeatedly into Lebanon in the 1970s, and in 1982 began an occupation of Lebanon that would last 18 years. In the summer of 1982, Israeli forces killed 18,000 Palestinians and Lebanese, mostly civilians, and wounded another 30,000. In September, Israeli forces surrounded the Beirut neighborhoods of Sabra and Shatila and didn't let anyone in or out as their right-wing Christian allies killed at least 1,000 Palestinian refugees living there. It wasn't to get the PLO. Both the Israeli and US governments were aware the PLO had already left Beirut for Tunis the month before. The purpose was to kill civilians. As in the 1948 and 1967 wars, refugees in the Lebanon War again became the principal victims of the Israeli drive for territory, security, and dominance. Their suffering had begun even before the invasion. They had been uprooted several times from 1976 during the Civil War and the early Israeli invasions. By 1979, 1.8 million refugees were registered in Lebanon. At the height of the 1982 Israeli invasion of Lebanon, the number was well beyond 2 million. Refugees were frustrated and angry about broken promises, being treated like serfs and pawns, losing their land, being harassed by soldiers and settlers. In 1987, the Intifada broke out in the refugee camps of Gaza. Along with demonstrations, the Intifada involved tactics ranging from strikes, boycotts, and withholding taxes to other ingenious forms of civil disobedience. Protests sometimes turned violent, often ignited by soldiers inflicting heavy casualties with live ammunition and rubber bullets used against unarmed demonstrators or youths throwing stones. Nevertheless, the uprising was predominantly non-violent and unarmed, a crucially important factor that helped mobilize sectors of society in addition to the young people protesting in the streets, while showing that the entirety of Palestinian society under occupation opposed the status quo and supported the Intifada. The First Intifada was an outstanding example of popular resistance against oppression and can be considered as being the first unmitigated victory for the Palestinians in the long colonial war that began in 1917. Unlike the 1936-39 revolt, the Intifada was driven by a broad strategic vision and a unified leadership, and it did not exacerbate internal Palestinian divisions. The initial uprising led to bolder acts of resistance, which generated ever more brutal backlash from Israel. Israel added to its inventory of collective punishment acts such as house demolition, the erection of high fences around refugee camps, and the assembling of men in the centers of villages, refugee camps, and neighborhoods, and abusing and torturing them. In 1993, the PLO was invited to peace talks with Israel. Israel and the US held most of the cards, and they were of one mind: to reject any agreement Israel did not fully approve of. An independent Palestinian state was never on the table. The treaty that emerged from Oslo just retrenched Palestinian oppression. Palestinians would now be policed by other Palestinians, working indirectly for the occupation, rather than Israeli soldiers. Well, not in Area C, which is most of the West Bank, but in the ever-shrinking areas A and B. So things didn't get better. Palestinians had less freedom of movement and fewer economic opportunities than ever. Until 1991, great numbers of Palestinians had worked in Israel without hindrance and without requiring a special permit. One could travel in a car with West Bank or Gaza license plates anywhere in Israel in the occupied territories. Any expectation of having that freedom restored was quickly quashed. The majority of the population could not obtain permits to travel and was now effectively confined to the West Bank or to the Gaza Strip, to the inferior roads dotted with checkpoints intended for the indigenous population, while the settlers rode above them on a network of superb highways and overpasses that was constructed for their exclusive use. This post-Oslo confinement was most constricting in the Gaza Strip. In the decades following 1993, the Strip was cut off from the rest of the world in stages, encircled by troops on land and the Israeli Navy by sea. Entering and leaving required rarely issued permits and became possible only through massive fortified checkpoints resembling human cattle pens, while arbitrary Israeli closures frequently interrupted the shipment of goods in and out of the Strip. The economic results of what was in effect a siege of the Gaza Strip were particularly damaging. Most Gazans depended on work in Israel or on exporting goods. With stringent restrictions on doing both, economic life underwent a slow strangulation. Rashid Khalidi argues rejecting the Oslo Accords would have been better for Palestinians than accepting them. Occupation would have continued as it has anyway, but without the veil of Palestinian self-government, without relieving Israel of the financial burden of governing and administrating a population of millions, and without security coordination. The worst outcome of Oslo, whereby the PA helps Israel police the rest of Palestinians living under its military regime as their lands are gradually appropriated by Israeli colonizers. That makes sense to me. How else does one stop believing they're unconditionally the good guy if they can't see why someone might have a different point of view? From 1994 onwards, Israel began a construction effort, including building new settlements and expanding old ones, and erecting border fences that delineated the partition of the West Bank prior to negotiations. By 1996, the settler population had increased by 48% in the West Bank and 62% in the Gaza Strip. All this made the settlers' eviction less realistic than ever. So tempers were high when, in 2000, Ariel Sharon visited the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, flanked by over 1,000 police officers. This was a deliberate provocation to show Palestinians Israel would continue to encroach on everything Palestinian and make it Israeli. When Palestinians in East Jerusalem rioted, Israeli forces fired over 1 million rounds at them in the first few days. This was the beginning of the Second Intifada. Over the next 5 years, suicide bombings killed up to 1,000 Israelis, and the extreme suppression of the uprising killed 3,000 Palestinians. In August 2005, Israel pulled the last settlers and troops protecting them out of Gaza. In January 2006, Hamas won the Palestinian Authority election. Israel and its allies refused to recognize the election outcome and painted all Palestinians as having voted for terror. Really, voters were just fed up with Fatah and its incompetence and complicity when Hamas had shown it would actually fight back. But no one in power cares what Palestinians say, so in 2000, when Hamas took over Gaza, Israel and Egypt closed the Gaza Strip and stopped letting all but a trickle of people and goods in or out. Nothing that can be used to build anything, or fertilizer to grow stuff, is allowed in, ostensibly because it could be used to make a bomb. The IDF erected a perimeter fence and does not hesitate to shoot you if you get too close. That's why it's become common to hear Gaza is the world's largest open-air prison. Between 2008 and 2021, Israel launched 4 major offensives on Gaza, each time killing hundreds or thousands of people. They targeted infrastructure, hospitals, schools, crops, power lines, sewer lines, and countless homes. The lopsided 43-to-1 scale of Palestinian to Israeli casualties is telling, as is the fact that the bulk of Israelis killed were soldiers while most of the Palestinians were civilians. But whenever anyone points out the targeting of civilians and the violations of the laws of war, Israelis draw pictures of what they say is happening, and say there was a bad guy there, so we had to kill everyone. We bombed civilians, therefore Hamas was using them as human shields. These get called conflicts and wars, but those words hide more than they reveal. In none of these conflicts were there two sides attacking each other. There was the IDF and the people of Gaza, most of whom hadn't attacked Israel in any way, didn't have anything to defend themselves with, didn't have missile defense systems and bomb shelters like Israelis, didn't have weapons beyond rifles that do nothing against bombs and white phosphorus. So people were already sick of being killed and maimed when the IDF showed up again in October 2023, taking license from the terrorist attack on Israel to yet again indiscriminately slaughter as many Palestinians as it could. About 60,000 people are confirmed dead. 15,000 of them children. Now the screws are tighter on Gaza than ever before as Israel attempts to choke the life out of everyone by denying them food. And if all that weren't bad enough, the blue sky accounts of people in Gaza are getting marked as spam and deleted because they're begging for money, because they're being starved. Well, if there are still any people whose accounts haven't been deactivated and I share their posts, please consider giving to them. With everything they've gone through, it's hard to think there's much of Israeli or Palestinian life that hasn't been shaped by trauma. The wounds are never given time to heal before they're opened up again. Distinguished Pakistani intellectual Iqbal Ahmed argued that given the course of Jewish history, especially in the 20th century, the use of force only strengthened a pre-existing and pervasive sense of victimhood among Israelis, while it unified Israeli society, reinforced the most militant tendencies in Zionism, and bolstered the support of external actors. It's hard to disagree, given how incredibly reactionary Israeli society has become, even just in the past few years. They don't like comparisons with the Nazis, but the similarities keep mounting. The Nazis used to experiment on their captives to see how little you could feed a person without killing them. I can't help but see parallels with what Israel is doing to Gaza today. They come from the same sick determination to wipe out any trace of the racial group they've decided is their existential enemy. They're blocking the entry of food and medical supplies to Gaza. They're destroying hospitals and torturing doctors. They say it's all to pressure Hamas, like all states who impose blockades say that's the purpose, but they're well aware that's not the real purpose. Weakening civil society and erasing the nation is the purpose. Israel and its allies are testing the limits of what they can get away with. The people who want to stop them don't have institutional power, because we don't live in representative democratic societies, but hierarchical authoritarian states. The moralizing human rights defender states of the so-called West are allies with Israel and supply them with the means to butcher Palestinians in the thousands. A couple of them are half-heartedly wagging their fingers at Israel, but unless we put way more pressure on them, I doubt they'll do much more than that. They've tolerated this many deaths, arrests, and land grabs, and they never say anything about West Bank apartheid, so obviously they couldn't care less about international law and human rights like they pretend. But states couldn't help us solve this problem anyway. States exist to divide and rule us. States can't heal the wounds they've created. They can't impose peace, just a temporary cessation of overt hostilities while the root causes simmer. As long as Israel exists, the apartheid and land grab and slow genocide will continue. You can temper the rigor with which the state and the right wing attempt to erase the Palestinians, but you can't stop it by going through existing institutions. The state can never end the cycle of trauma. The state has created this toxic environment where stress and pain and misery are commonplace. We need to build new institutions based on egalitarian decision-making and mutual aid, and destroy the ones that exist to punish people who get in their way. Through organizing, we learn to relate to each other as equals, to treat each other as equally worthy of freedom, peace, joy, and love. We would transform the conditions that pass on trauma. Obviously, it's a tall order, requiring a lot of time and commitment, encountering a lot of opposition and setbacks. But it's either work towards that or continue to wallow through this empty, meaningless consumer culture with our heads down. If you want to learn more about why we need radical measures, or what you can do, click on one of these videos. Thank you.